Why was a soldier sitting, cross-legged in the middle of combat, as if the chaos around her didn't exist? Paint rounds cracked against plywood walls, boots slammed into dirt. Instructors barked orders, their voices cutting through the Arizona heat. Men fell, alarms buzzed, and the drill moved fast, too fast for anyone who hesitated. And yet in the far corner of Fort's training yard, one figure sat still. Staff Sergeant. Eyes closed, breathing even, cross-legged on the ground as if in meditation. To the untrained eye she looked asleep. Her squad saw weakness, a liability, dead weight that would get them all killed. Instructors saw failure, another soldier who didn't belong. But what no one realized in that moment was that she wasn't sleeping. She was listening, counting the rhythm of gunfire, tracing every step across the gravel, memorizing the tone of each command. And then the sound of tires on gravel. A black SUV rolled slowly through the gate. Dark windows, government plates, dust curling up behind it, heads turned. Soldiers faltered mid-drill, helmets swiveling, rifles still in hand. From the vehicle stepped a commander with eyes sharp as steel. He didn't shout. He didn't announce himself. He just stood, watching. And for a single instant, the woman they mocked as a dreamer opened her eyes. But that moment passed. She lowered her gaze. Her squad never noticed. And the name whispered later in the barracks stuck. Sleepwalker. Hours before that drill, the desert had already burned with its own kind of hostility. At 5:30, the air was heavy, grit stinging skin, every breath carrying the taste of sand. The cracked asphalt shimmered under the rising sun, heat bending the horizon. Soldiers cursed, hauling rucks from transport vans, boots crunching against gravel. Stepped down with one duffel slung over her shoulder. She moved without wasted effort, neither rushing nor dragging. Her silence set her apart. Others clumped together, trading jokes, cursing the heat, pretending not to feel nerves. Walked alone. No small talk. No attempt to blend. The admin clerk at the desk didn't even look up when he spoke. Bunk 28, chow at 6:30, formation at 800, don't be late. She nodded once, took the key card, and walked. That steady, measured pace never broke, not even in the suffocating air of the barracks. The room reeked of bleach and old leather, metal bunks lined like mirrors. She chose the corner bunk near the emergency exit. From there she had to both doors. Old instincts always know your exits, always know where to run. Her squad noticed her silence at chow. She sat by the window, food arranged with neat precision, fork aligned at the same angle every time she set it down. They didn't understand. They didn't try to. Instead, Lieutenant Parker Vance, the kind of officer whose confidence came louder than his ability, made sure his words carried. Some of us earn our way here. Others, maybe somebody just felt sorry for them. The men around him laughed. Built like a wrestler, smirked. Jonah Briggs' restless eyes muttered something under his breath. Tyler Holt laughed too loud, desperate to belong. The mocking followed as she carried her tray away. She didn't answer. She didn't look back. She just filed their faces away quietly. The first test should have been simple. The rifle range stretched beneath a brass-colored sky, targets hanging at 180 meters. Easy shots for anyone with skill. 30 soldiers, 10 targets each, 3 minutes. The whistle blew, rifles barked, brass casings clattering across the dirt. Instructors stalked behind, clipboards ready, raised her weapon, sight picture clean, breathing steady, finger brushing near the trigger. And then she lowered it. She never fired a shot. When the ceasefire whistle blew, her target stood untouched. The instructor's jaw clenched. "Kaine, you plan on sightseeing, or you want to join the army today?" Her voice was flat, quiet, then shoot. But the second string was the same. Rifle up, perfect form, rifle down, no rounds fired. By the end, whispers trailed her back to the barracks. Fake record, dead weight, can't shoot. She walked on without reaction, the heat rippling off her calm face like it couldn't touch her. The obstacle course was worse. 14 challenges, 25 minutes, a gauntlet designed to break even the strongest. Whistle blew. Soldiers surged forward, shouts echoing off the walls, boots pounding, sand spraying. Vance scrambled up the 8-foot wall, showboating on the other side, muscled his way over. Briggs moved with speed. Holt followed, panting but determined. Walked to the wall, she stopped. 3 seconds passed. Then she sat down cross-legged in the dirt, eyes closed, breathing steady. "Move it," Vance's voice cracked across the yard. She didn't move. She stayed seated, calm as stone. By the time her squad staggered back, soaked in sweat, she rose without hurry, brushed dirt from her trousers, and jogged back into formation. No explanation, no apology. The laughter started then, snickers from other squads, a new nickname whispered, Sleepwalker. And still she never reacted. Her expression never cracked. The mockery followed her into the urban combat drills. Plywood houses, hostages, civilian role players, stairwells filled with paint rounds and smoke. Vance barked assignments, handing her the worst role possible. Just try to keep up. The door rammed open. Her squad surged inside, weapons up. Paint rounds cracked like thunder in the narrow halls. Within 30 seconds they were falling, caught a round in the chest. Briggs froze in a doorway. Holt took one from upstairs. Vance shouted, firing wildly until paint spattered his helmet. And in the corner sat, eyes closed, breathing even. When the buzzer screamed, when red lights flashed the failure, Vance ripped his helmet off and stormed at her. "You didn't fire one round. We're dead because of you." She opened her eyes, calm. Rear security was maintained. Vance laughed, high and bitter. "We're all dead. What world is that security?" The instructor cut him off before fists flew, but his voice was ice when he spoke to her. "One more failure and you're gone." "Yes, Sergeant." Flat calm. By evening the nickname had spread through every hall, every barracks. Sleepwalker, nap time, dead weight. Soldiers snickered when she passed. They called it loud enough for her to hear. She never reacted. She ate alone. She cleaned her gear with surgical precision. But one man was watching. Chief Warrant Officer Grant Mercer. He saw what others didn't. The way her rifle parts were laid out on her bunk, perfectly aligned, each magazine lip inspected, every bolt polished. He saw her hands running silent manipulation drills when she thought no one looked. Those weren't the hands of a coward. They were hands sharpened by years in dangerous places. Mercer leaned against a doorway, arms folded, watching. Something about her didn't add up. The squad only saw someone failing every drill. Mercer saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. The next morning the whispers were louder. She should have her own program, they said. Pillow Ops. Special Nap Forces. Vance laughed loudest. Holt joined in, desperate to belong. Even Briggs smirked. Never glanced their way. She finished her meal, stacked her tray, and walked out. Mercer's eyes caught something most would have missed. A strip of faded rubber band snug around her wrist. She batted it with her thumb, a snap of tension and release, rhythm like a pulse. Later he saw a tarnished brass coin roll across her knuckles with reflexive ease. Not a nervous tick, muscle memory, control tools. Not fatigue, not failure, regulation. But no one else noticed. Not yet. And still the tension grew heavier every day. Her silence wasn't just misunderstood, it became proof in their eyes that she didn't belong. Every march, every chow, she felt the weight of their stares. And yet she moved the same way she always had. Calm, steady. Mercer kept writing in his notebook. One phrase repeated across the page in thick pencil strokes. Something doesn't fit. But the squad didn't see it. They only saw the ghost of a soldier who seemed half asleep. And what none of them could imagine was that a single word, a code none of them knew, would wake her into something they'd never forget. Why did she never fight back when they mocked her? At chow, the voices carried again. Soldiers laughing too loud, making sure she heard every jab. Pillow Ops, Holt chuckled. Special Nap Forces, added, smirking as his fork clattered against the tray. Even Briggs, usually cautious, let himself grin. And Vance, he leaned back in his chair like a man untouchable, his voice pitched high enough for the whole hall. She should get her own show. Sleepwalker, a soldier's guide to staying useless. The laughter spread like wildfire. But didn't flinch, didn't blink. She finished her food in neat, precise bites, utensils placed back on her tray with machine-like control. Then she stood, stacked the tray, and walked out, eyes forward, expression unreadable. The silence she carried unnerved Mercer more than the noise others hurled at her. It wasn't numbness. It wasn't shame. It was something else, like she was storing every detail, waiting. He noticed the rubber band again, that little snap of tension and release at her wrist. He noticed the coin sliding across her knuckles when she thought no one was watching. It was the same with her breathing, controlled, measured, steady. Not lazy, not unfocused, something else. Mercer scribbled in his notebook, self-regulation, tools, not fatigue. That afternoon's drill brought the first crack in the squad's certainty. The rifles were loaded for a live simulation run. Sweat dripped down foreheads, the scent of powder heavy in the air. Holt snapped his magazine in too fast. A jam. Jonah Briggs raised his rifle, squeezed the trigger, click. Silence. His eyes widened in panic. The barrel began to smoke, trapped gas building toward disaster. And before anyone else saw it, before even the instructors reacted, spoke. Her eyes closed. Calm voice. Switch mag now. Jonah froze, then obeyed, ripping the magazine free, slamming a new one home. The rifle clacked, cleared, cooling before it could explode in his hands. His mouth hung open. How did you? She didn't answer. She just snapped her rubber band once, breathing steady, eyes closed again. Mercer's pencil dug into paper, not guessing, listening, calculation, control. But Vance didn't want to see it. Holt sneered. Don't encourage her, she just got lucky. Jonah wanted to argue, but his voice fell flat under their contempt. He muttered his thanks too quietly for anyone else to hear. By the next morning, the weight pressed down harder. The senior instructor lined them up, voice sharp as barbed wire. Ward, this is your final warning. Another failure and you're gone. No appeals, no second chances. His reply was flat. Yes, Sergeant. No protest, no defense, just that calm tone that made them hate her more. Vance stepped forward, jaw tight, his voice loud enough for everyone. Hear that? One more nap in your history. Sleep through another drill and you'll bury us all. Laughed under his breath. Holt snorted. Even Briggs muttered, she's going to get us killed. And the nickname became their truth. Sleepwalker. It clung to her like dust in the desert air. That night in the barracks, the silence was worse than noise. Conversations died when she walked in. Boots polished louder. Bags zipped shut too fast. Holt whispered just enough for her to hear. Sleepwalker. She didn't react. She unpacked her weapon with the same precise care. Bolt carriers, springs, pins, each piece aligned in a straight line. Cleaned, inspected, polished. Not the work of someone careless. Not the work of someone untrained. Mercer leaned in the doorway watching. He wrote again, habits of a survivor, not a quitter. Later, Jonah caught up to her outside the mess hall. His voice was awkward, low. You saved me yesterday, with the jam. I don't know how you. She stopped him with just a glance. Not anger, just stillness. And then she walked on. Jonah's voice fell into the empty air. Doesn't matter, they'll never see it. He turned away, too afraid to be seen siding with her. Days stacked up, the heat pressed down heavier, the contempt sharpened, mockery became routine, and still she kept that same deliberate pace, calm, unmoved. Vance grew bolder, convinced dismissal was inevitable. The squad convinced themselves she was a liability. Even instructors stopped seeing her as a soldier, treating her like a mistake they wanted erased. But Mercer couldn't shake the feeling. Something doesn't fit. The pressure cooker was set to burst. Everyone knew it. They just didn't know when. The final evaluation came like a verdict. 20 minutes, multiple plywood buildings, hostages inside, unknown number of armed role players waiting in ambush. The kind of test that ended careers if you failed. The whistle shrieked. The squad surged forward, boots pounding, weapons raised. Vance barked orders, hungry to prove himself. Fired too wide, chewing splinters off door frames. Briggs followed, reckless speed. Holt scrambled after, nerves cracking his aim. And then it unraveled. A role player popped from a window, tagging Square in the chest. Alarm buzzed, out. Briggs caught a flank round, helmet lit with paint. Holt tried to cover an angle but fell in the stairwell, hit clean. Vance shouted commands into chaos, unheard. And in the first room sat, cross-legged, eyes closed, breathing steady. From the observation deck, instructors shook their heads, clipboards ready to mark her dismissal, final failure. Mercer leaned forward, frowning. He wasn't ready to write her off, not yet. And then gravel crunched outside the gate. A black SUV rolled through the dust, dark windows, government plates, the kind of vehicle that turned heads without asking permission. Every soldier stilled, every instructor paused. The doors opened, out stepped Commander Cross. Late 40s, weathered face, a man who didn't need medals or rank on his chest to make the air shift around him. His stride was deliberate, boots sinking into gravel with quiet weight. He walked past soldiers without a glance, past the instructors, past the whispers, straight toward Mercer. Chief Mercer, his voice was level. I'm not here to review, I'll run one scenario, not a review, activate. Mercer blinked. He knew the word activate, he understood its weight. Commander Cross stepped to the edge of the platform, his gaze locked on the plywood building where chaos reigned. His voice cut the air, sharp as steel. Echo recall, engage. For one heartbeat, the world froze. Gunfire muted, shouts blurred, time itself seemed to pause. A single click echoed, safety off. Ent's eyes opened. The lethargy vanished, the calm dissolved into precision. Her body unfolded in one fluid motion, rifle to shoulder, steps like liquid, muzzle tracking before the doorway even opened. A hostile burst through. She fired 2 controlled shots, center mass, target down. She moved without pause, flowing through angles, anticipating ambushes, firing with surgical accuracy. The squad could only stare. The woman they mocked, the soldier they dismissed as a liability, was suddenly something else entirely. Vance, paint splattered across his helmet, lay sprawled on the floor, watching in disbelief. And the instructor stopped writing, clipboards dangling from numb fingers. Mercer whispered under his breath, almost reverent, "What are you?" No one had the answer yet. But they were about to find out. How could someone change so completely in a single breath? The last thing anyone expected was motion. But when Commander Cross spoke the code, the stillness inside shattered. One moment she was stone, the next, fluid precision. Her rifle rose as if it had been waiting in her hands all along. The muzzle snapped to a doorway just as it cracked open. A role player lunged in with his weapon. 2 paint rounds burst from his rifle, center mass, before the man even registered her movement. He froze, the flashing red hit light signaling elimination. The squad stared from the floor, stunned. She flowed past them without a glance. Her boots whispered across the plywood floor, her body cutting corners with the kind of economy that spoke of endless rehearsals. She wasn't guessing. She was reading the battlefield like it was written on the walls. Another shadow moved in a window upstairs. One controlled shot, perfect placement, tagged the hostile instantly. He stumbled back, blinking under his mask, his vest lit red. Vance, helmet dripping with paint, gaped in disbelief. For weeks he had mocked her as dead weight. Now his arrogance had nowhere to hide. She moved up the stairwell, body hugging the wall, rifle tracking each angle, breath measured, eyes alive in a way none of them had ever seen. On the landing she froze, not out of hesitation, out of awareness. A shaft of light cut through the slats of wood. Dust motes drifted inside it, but the scatter didn't look right. A shadow broke the pattern, someone waiting. Pivoted sharply, fired once. The role player fell before his ambush was even triggered. Gasps carried faintly from the observation deck. Clipboards hung loose. Stopwatches were forgotten. Soldiers who had written her off as a failure now leaned forward, afraid to blink. Downstairs, the squad huddled where they'd fallen. They whispered, almost afraid their voices would disturb whatever ghost had awakened. "What is she?" murmured. No one answered. Upstairs reached the door at the end of the hall. She braced a hand on the frame, feeling the tension in the hinges. Old wood groaned under pressure. She adjusted her grip, finding the balance that would silence it. With one smooth press, the door swung open without a squeak. Two hostiles waited inside. A civilian role player bound to a chair sat between them, wide-eyed. It was the kind of no-win geometry that had defeated squads again and again. She calculated it in a glance. Backdrop angles, ricochet risk. Her breath slowed. 2 steps left, rifle raised, 2 shots. Both men froze, paint blooming across their chests. The civilian role player raised his hand slowly, the signal for secured. And then silence. No alarms, no whistles, just the heavy quiet of a mission accomplished. Lowered her weapon, safety on. She guided the civilian up, checked restraints, and signaled all clear. Her breathing evened out again, the storm within her already folding back into calm. On the platform, no one spoke. No one clapped. They just stared, their faces pale, eyes wide, as if they had witnessed something unnatural. Vance ripped his helmet off, words failing on his lips. Holt sat frozen on the floor, too stunned to even mock. Shook his head slowly, trying to erase what he had seen. Briggs whispered what none of them wanted to admit. "What was that?" Didn't answer. She simply cleared her weapon, chamber check, safety engaged, before walking past them without a glance. Her expression unreadable, her eyes steady. Commander Cross turned from the platform. His mission here was done, but everyone knew something irreversible had happened. The soldier they had called Sleepwalker had just dismantled a full scenario alone, and she hadn't done it like a prodigy or a natural. She had done it like someone conditioned, rehearsed, built for it. Mercer's throat was dry. He had suspected she was more than she seemed, but he hadn't expected this. She was precision unleashed, like a locked weapon suddenly given the order to fire. In the debrief room, the air buzzed with fluorescent hum. Bleach and gun oil mingled in the sterile cold. Sat at a folding table, her rifle in pieces before her. Each component was cleaned with the same surgical precision she carried in every action. Across from her sat Commander Cross, beside him Mercer, both watching for different reasons. Cross broke the silence. Echo recall program, 18 months in places without names, 0 friendly casualties, 100% extractions. Mercer's eyes widened. He had heard whispers of units that didn't officially exist, but seeing one seated across the table, calm and silent, was something else entirely. Cross's tone was even. Their conditioning requires authorization. Without the phrase, they remain dormant. With it, they operate at full capacity. Slid her bolt carrier into place, unbothered. Mercer pulled something from his pocket, a brass coin, tarnished, worn smooth by years of fingers. He rolled it across the table. It wobbled, started to fall. Her hand shot out. She caught it mid-drop without looking. Reflex. Mercer exhaled. A guard dog on a leash, only bites when told. Cross nodded once. Exactly. The door creaked. Lieutenant Vance stepped in, pale, his helmet hanging heavy in his hands. He looked smaller now, stripped of his swagger. For a moment he couldn't speak. His jaw worked, words failing. Cross's gaze landed on him, steady as iron. "Lieutenant, you won't apologize. That's not your assignment." Vance blinked, "Sir. You'll draft a new SOP, procedures for handling operatives under special conditioning, activation, supervision, integration, every failure accounted for. That's your penance." The humiliation landed heavier than any rebuke. Vance swallowed hard. Understood. It wasn't forgiveness, it was correction, a system rewriting itself. Clicked the last piece of her rifle into place. Clean, whole. She folded the rag, set it aside, her eyes finally lifted. Cross leaned back slightly. His voice softened, not gentle but deliberate. "You're being reassigned. Special Operations Training Command, not as a student, as an instructor." Her eyes flickered just briefly, surprise, then it passed, her voice was flat again. "Wherever you need me, but not as a showpiece." "No showpieces," Cross said. "Just teaching, passing it on." Mercer frowned. "Why not keep her in the field if she's this effective?" Cross cut him off, tone low. "Because people like her have already given enough. They've lived in shadows, carried the weight, done what others couldn't. At some point they've earned the right to step back, to pass it on." The room went quiet. Mercer had no argument left. That night the barracks felt different. The usual mockery was gone. No whispers, no smirks, just silence when she entered. And Holt sat by the door, gear half-packed. When she walked past, they stood, not to salute, not to speak, but to move aside. A quiet respect. Briggs kept his head down, polishing his weapon in nervous silence. And Vance, he sat hunched over his bunk, scribbling furiously into a notebook labeled Draft SOP. The jaw, once tight with arrogance, now carried grim resolve. Packed her duffel slowly, the same way she did everything. Measured, calm, no rush. Outside, the desert night stretched wide. Moonlight cut pale lines across the asphalt. A black SUV idled near the gate, headlights spilling long shadows. Cross stood by the open door, waiting. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Slung her duffel over her shoulder and walked forward. At the gate, she paused, turned once. The barracks windows glowed faintly. Shadows shifted behind them, but no one called her Sleepwalker anymore. She turned back, climbed into the SUV. The door shut with a heavy thud. The engine rumbled. The vehicle rolled into the night, tail lights fatting across the horizon. No applause, no medals, just departure. But Mercer stood in the distance, watching, his notebook clutched in his hand. He had seen her awakened by one word. He had seen what the others couldn't understand, and he knew the price she carried. Tomorrow training would continue as if nothing had changed. New squads, new drills, but whispers would remain. Whispers of what they had seen. Whispers of the code that woke the Sleepwalker. Why was the silence heavier than the gunfire? The SUV was gone, its red tail lights swallowed by the desert night. For a long moment, the soldiers who remained at fort didn't move. The yard that usually echoed with clanging gear, shouted orders, and crude jokes was hushed. Even the cicadas seemed to quiet, as though the desert itself had witnessed something too sharp to echo back. Vance sat on his bunk, the notebook heavy in his lap. The words Draft SOP scrawled across the cover looked nothing like authority. They looked like punishment. He stared at the blank page, pen hovering, but the words refused to come. For years, his confidence had been built on volume and bravado. Now, for the first time, he wondered what it meant to lead when silence was louder than command. Polished his boots until the leather shone, though there was no inspection scheduled. The mindless rhythm calmed him, but each stroke carried the memory of rifle fire, controlled, surgical, nothing wasted. He had thought strength was force, muscle, power. She had shown him otherwise. Holt packed and repacked his gear, his nervous hands never still. For days he had been the loudest with the jokes, special nap forces. Now the words burned like ash. He had seen her eyes open at the command. He had seen what precision really looked like. And for the first time he understood how small he was. Briggs kept his head down, cleaning his weapon again and again, though it was already spotless. He muttered under his breath, Not prayers exactly, but fragments of disbelief. He wanted to ask questions, but fear clamped them down. The barracks air was different. No more smirks when she passed, no more laughter under breath. They weren't afraid of any more. They were afraid of what she represented. Mercer walked the hallways with his notebook pressed against his chest. His mind replayed every detail, the rubber band on her wrist, the coin across her knuckles, the way she breathed through mockery as if it never touched her. He had thought she was strange. He had thought she was stubborn. Now he knew she had been carrying something far heavier. But what unsettled him wasn't just her transformation. It was the thought that there might be others. How many soldiers walked among them, hiding under silence, waiting for a word that could unlock who they really were? He wrote on the last page of his notebook, "Sleepwalkers exist." That night none of the men slept well. Vance stared at the ceiling, hearing again the echo of Cross's voice, "Activate." Holt turned restlessly, the mocking nickname he had once used now stabbing back at him like a blade. Clenched his fists in the dark, ashamed of every laugh he had joined. Briggs whispered into the silence, what if she'd stayed asleep? What if no one had spoken the code? No one answered. The next morning formation went on as if nothing had happened. New drills, new routines, but the air carried weight. Instructors barked orders, but their eyes flickered with unease. They had all seen her move. They had all seen what one soldier could do when unlocked. Mercer stood at the edge of the yard, arms crossed, face drawn. He wanted to ask Cross more. He wanted to know how long the program had existed, how many were hidden. But he also knew some answers were never given freely. The soldiers trained, sweat darkening their uniforms, boots thudding against the dirt. But whispers threaded through every squad. She never fired a shot. She didn't need to until she wanted. One word changed everything. The story spread faster than orders. Within hours, the barracks buzzed with it. Within days, it became something else entirely. A rumor, a ghost tale, the story of a soldier who slept through every drill until the right code woke her into something terrifying. No one used her nickname anymore. Sleepwalker wasn't a joke now. It was a warning. Across the desert, sat quietly in the back of the SUV as the headlights cut through endless dark. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't need to. For years, she had lived without questions, moving where ordered, waiting for the voice that could unseal what she carried. Her duffel rested at her feet. The brass coin sat in her palm. She rolled it across her knuckles, the motion so natural it was almost unconscious. Each flip of the coin carried weight. Each turn was a reminder of what she'd lost to become what she was. Cross sat in the front passenger seat, silent. He didn't explain himself. He didn't need to. His presence was explanation enough. For there was no anger, no pride, no relief. Only the calm that came with knowing the mask was back in place. She was invisible again. The SUV hummed into the distance, and with it, the soldier called Sleepwalker vanished into the shadows once more. Back at Mercer stayed late in the observation tower, the desert stretching endless in every direction. The stars shimmered above, cold and indifferent. He thought about the coin, the rubber band, the way her eyes snapped open at one word. He thought about how quickly they had judged her, how fast laughter had turned into silence. The moral settled heavy in his chest. The world mocks what it doesn't understand. In the chow hall days later, the whispers were quieter, but they never stopped. New recruits overheard pieces of the story. Some said she had been broken. Some said she was an experiment. Some said she was a ghost in uniform. The truth was simpler and heavier. She was a soldier built for things they couldn't imagine, carrying weight they would never see. Mercer shut his notebook for the last time. His final line stayed burned into his thoughts. Sleepwalkers exist. He wondered how many had walked past him before. Soldiers who looked ordinary. Soldiers who seemed like failures. Soldiers who carried something invisible, waiting. And he wondered if he would ever look at silence the same way again. Sometimes, he realized, Silence wasn't weakness. Sometimes silence was survival. The desert sun rose again, spilling gold across fort. Boots struck asphalt. Whistles blew. Soldiers cursed the heat. Life went on. But for those who had seen open her eyes, nothing would ever be the same. Why would the military take its sharpest blade and sheath it in silence? The SUV rolled to a stop at a compound far from. The desert was the same: dust, stars, endless horizon. But the walls here were taller, the gates thicker, the guards sharper in their stances. Floodlights cut through the night, pale beams bouncing off concrete. Stepped out, duffel slung over one shoulder, boots landing soft against asphalt. No fanfare, no salutes, just the quiet transfer of a shadow from one place to another. Inside, the compound felt stripped of personality. Long hallways, metal doors, no names, only numbers. She was led into a room with bare walls and a single desk. A binder sat waiting. "Special Operations Training Command," Cross said. His voice carried no room for argument. "You'll instruct, not as a story, not as a spectacle, just instruction. You pass on what you've carried, nothing more." She nodded once, understood. Her tone was flat, but the flicker in her eyes betrayed something else. Not pride, not relief, something quieter, maybe acceptance. Mercer had followed along, though he wasn't sure why he'd been allowed. He leaned against the wall, arms folded, notebook in hand. He studied her the way he always had, searching for details, looking for the thread between silence and violence. "What makes her different from the rest?" he asked Cross. Cross didn't look at him. Discipline layered until instinct. Conditioning forged past the point of choice. She doesn't think when the code is spoken. She remembers. "Remembers what?" Mercer pressed. Cross finally turned, his gaze sharp. "Places we don't write down." That ended the conversation. Days turned into weeks, adapted to her new role without question. She rose before dawn, her steps steady, her voice calm, her lessons sharper than the recruits expected. She didn't shout, she didn't humiliate, she didn't even raise her tone. Yet when she stood in front of a classroom, the silence was thicker than any sergeant's bark. "Check your angles," she told them one morning, her words clipped and precise. "Corners don't forgive mistakes." The recruits listened, pens scratching against paper. "Your breathing controls more than your trigger finger," she said another day. "You panic, you miss. You measure, you survive." Her lectures weren't dramatic. They were clinical. But every word carried the weight of lived truth. The students knew it. They felt it in the way she moved, the way her eyes measured every space like it was already mapped. Some tried to challenge her at first. Fresh recruits with chips on their shoulders, testing boundaries. One fired too quickly on the range, wasting rounds in wild bursts, corrected him with calm precision, then raised her own rifle. One magazine, 30 rounds, 10 targets, 3 minutes. Every round landed clean. The paper hung shredded in perfect clusters. She didn't gloat, she didn't explain. She simply lowered the rifle, cleared it, and walked away. The recruit never tested her again. Word spread quickly. Stories always did. At the whispers twisted into legend. Soldiers who had mocked her now spoke of her with unease. The name Sleepwalker wasn't a joke anymore. It was something else, something they couldn't quite define. Holt sat in the chow hall one night, his tray untouched. He stared at the table, remembering her calm face, the way she had ignored every insult. "We called her dead weight," he muttered, voice low. "She carried all of us." Didn't answer. He just clenched his jaw, polishing his weapon until his hands ached. Vance worked late into the night, drafting procedures with grim focus. Every page he wrote felt like penance. He had wanted her gone. He had wanted her erased. Now he was writing policy to make sure no one like him could ever misjudge her again. Mercer visited sometimes. He stood at the back of the training yard, notebook tucked under his arm, watching her with the new squads. He noticed the same habits, the rubber band snapping quietly at her wrist, the coin sliding across her knuckles in moments between drills. He finally asked her one evening, when the yard was empty. "Why the band, why the coin?" She didn't look up, to stay awake. "You weren't asleep," he said. Her eyes flickered to him, calm, steady. "No, but they needed to believe I was." He wanted to ask more, what it meant, what it cost her, but the way she turned back to her rifle told him enough. Some answers weren't given, some weights weren't shared. Weeks turned into months, her students sharpened under her guidance. They didn't leave with swagger or bravado. They left quieter, steadier, their movements deliberate, their eyes alert. She didn't build soldiers who looked impressive. She built soldiers who survived. And with every class, the legend of the Sleepwalker grew. Recruits whispered about the woman who could fire without missing, who sat silent until one word woke her into something terrifying. They said she had fought in places unnamed, carried scars no one could see. Some swore she was a machine. Others whispered she was cursed. Never confirmed anything. She let the rumors live. Sometimes silence told the truest story. Cross kept his distance. He oversaw her work but rarely spoke. When he did, his words were always the same: no showpieces, just instruction. But even he couldn't stop the story from spreading. Mercer knew it too. He watched the way soldiers lowered their voices when her name came up, the way recruits carried themselves differently after her classes. She had become something larger than the woman herself. And yet she never seemed to notice. Or maybe she noticed and simply didn't care. She packed her duffel the same way, ate her meals in the same quiet precision, rolled the same coin across her knuckles at night. One evening, after the yard had emptied, Mercer lingered again. He asked the question that had haunted him since the first day. "Why did you let them mock you? Why not show them sooner?" Set her rifle down, her hands still. For the first time, something broke through her calm, a shadow in her eyes. Because sometimes silence teaches more than action. He frowned. What did it teach them? She looked at him steady. That judgment comes easy, respect doesn't. Then she picked up the coin, rolled it across her knuckles again, and said nothing more. Mercer walked away with the answer echoing in his chest. She had let them believe she was broken. She had carried their scorn in silence. And when the moment came, she had shown them who she really was. Not to prove herself, not to earn their approval, but to remind them of something heavier. Sometimes strength isn't in noise. Sometimes it's in waiting. Why did her recruits look less like soldiers and more like shadows? The courtyard at Special Operations Training Command rang with the sounds of practice, boots pounding against gravel, rifles clacking with dry-fire drills, instructors barking corrections. But class was different. There was no shouting, no chaos, only silence broken by her measured words. "Again," she said softly, watching the recruits clear a corner, "your breathing gives you away. Slow it." The men and women adjusted, their shoulders rising and falling under the desert heat. She waited, eyes sharp, again. It wasn't punishment, it wasn't cruelty, it was repetition. And by the third run their movements had shifted, quieter, smoother, less reckless. Mercer watched from the shade of the tower, notebook balanced on his arm. He'd been tracking her for weeks, writing down every detail, searching for the thread between training and transformation. What he saw unnerved him. Her recruits weren't just learning tactics, they were learning her silence. By the end of the session, their laughter had gone, their bravado had drained. They moved with precision. Their eyes stayed on the edges of shadows. She dismissed them without ceremony. "Clean your rifles, eat, rest, tomorrow again." The recruits scattered, sweat streaking their faces, but none complained. None rolled their eyes. They carried the weight of her lessons in their steps. Mercer closed his notebook slowly. He had been in the army long enough to know when something shifted beneath the surface. And this was a shift. She wasn't just training soldiers. She was creating reflections of herself. That night, he found her sitting alone in the armory, rifle broken down into neat rows of pieces, the brass coin rolling across her knuckles in steady rhythm. "Do you know what you're doing to them?" he asked. She didn't look up, teaching. "They're not the same as they were a month ago. They laugh less, they move differently, they're quieter." Her hand stilled, the coin balanced between two fingers. "Noise gets you killed." "And silence," he pressed. She finally looked at him. Her eyes were calm, steady, but tired. "Silence keeps you alive. It's not about making them like me. It's about making sure they survive." Mercer wanted to argue, but the weight in her voice stopped him. This wasn't theory for her. It was lived truth. She had survived places they would never name, and survival had left its mark. Still, a question gnawed at him. At what cost? Days blurred into more training. The recruits became sharper with each session. On the range, their groups tightened. In the obstacle courses, their times improved. In simulations, their failures grew fewer. But more than that, their demeanor shifted. Where they had once joked in the chow hall, they now sat quieter. Where they had once boasted about scores, they now cleaned their rifles in silence. They weren't just learning tactics. They were absorbing her restraint, her detachment. Mercer noted it all. His pencil scratched across the page, efficiency rising, morale shifting, personality narrowing. He wondered if the military understood what it was asking her to pass on. One evening, after a long simulation run, one of the recruits, a young private named, approached Mercer outside the training yard. His face was pale, his hands still trembling from adrenaline. "Sir," he said quietly, "she doesn't train like anyone else. She doesn't yell, she doesn't threaten, she just waits. And it makes you want to get it right." Mercer frowned. "Does it work?" Hesitated. "Yeah, too well. I don't even hear the noise anymore, just the silence. It follows me." Then he walked away, leaving Mercer with the words heavy in his chest. "The silence follows me." That night Mercer sat in his quarters, flipping through his notes. Every line seemed to blur together: control, regulation, silence, precision. He thought about the coin, the rubber band, the way she carried herself through humiliation without breaking. He thought about the moment she had opened her eyes at the code. And he asked himself, was this training making them stronger, or was it hollowing them into something else? Never seemed to question it. She arrived at dawn, taught with calm detachment, left at dusk. She ate alone, cleaned her rifle with surgical care, rolled her coin until it caught the dim light. Her silence was discipline, but it was also distance. Mercer tried again one evening. He found her sitting by the yard's edge, the desert wind tugging at her braid. "You're shaping them into you," he said quietly. She didn't turn. "They'll thank me when it saves them. And if it costs them something else." Her gaze stayed on the horizon. Everything costs something. It wasn't cold. It wasn't harsh. It was truth, spoken in the tone of someone who had already paid more than most could imagine. Mercer sat beside her in silence, the desert stretching endless before them. He wanted to argue. He wanted to press. But the way she sat, shoulders steady, breathing calm, told him this wasn't theory for her. This was survival carved into her bones. Back at the whispers had grown into stories. New recruits who had never met her spoke her name in hushed tones. Some said she had been asleep for weeks until a commander spoke the word that woke her. Others said she was a failed soldier given one last chance, only to reveal herself as something beyond human. They never got the details right, but it didn't matter. Stories weren't meant to be accurate, they were meant to last. And her story was lasting. One night, Mercer overheard two young corporals in the chow hall. "Sleepwalker's real. My buddy swore he saw her clear a building alone." "Yeah, but you don't get to see her unless you're chosen. They say she's gone now, teaching shadows." Mercer walked past without correcting them. He understood something now, had become more than a soldier. She had become a symbol. But the weight of that symbol was heavy, and Mercer couldn't shake the question. What would happen if too many soldiers carried her silence? What kind of army would that build? Later, in the dim light of his quarters, he wrote one line at the bottom of his notebook: strength without noise, survival without self. And he wondered if the cost was worth it. Meanwhile, prepared for another dawn, another class, another line of recruits who would leave quieter than they had arrived. She tied her braid, rolled the coin, snapped the band at her wrist. And when the sun rose over the desert, she walked back into the yard, steady, calm, unreadable. The legend continued. Why did the silence around her past feel heavier than the silence she carried now? Mercer had watched her for months, scribbling observations into his notebook until the pages blurred. The recruits sharpened, grew quieter, and moved with her same measured precision. But it wasn't enough for him. He wanted to know the root. He wanted to know where the silence came from. One night, in a dim office thick with cigarette smoke, he asked Commander Cross directly, "Sir, where did she come from?" Cross didn't look up from the file he was reviewing. His tone was steady. "You don't want to know. I've seen what she can do. I've seen the effect she has. I need to understand." Cross finally closed the file, eyes heavy with the weight of years. 18 months, 3 countries, places we'll never admit existed. She wasn't chosen for talent. She was chosen because she didn't break. Every other candidate folded. She didn't. Mercer's jaw tightened, and the code. Cross's gaze cut sharp. Conditioning, words tied to reflexes, triggers burned deeper than memory. Mercer shook his head slowly. "That's not a soldier, that's programming." "Call it what you like," Cross replied. "She carried men out who would been left behind. She got civilians through when others failed. She did the job, that's all that matters." Mercer wanted to argue, but the commander's tone left no room. The meeting ended with silence pressing down heavier than orders. Later that week, Mercer found sitting alone in the empty range, her rifle stripped down, the brass coin rolling back and forth across the bench. The desert wind whistled through the open bay doors, carrying grit across the concrete floor. "Cross told me a little," Mercer said. She didn't look up. "A little is already too much. You were in places we'll never name. You were conditioned, a code word. Is it true?" She placed the coin flat on the bench, her hand hovering above it. For the first time, her calm cracked, not with anger, not with fear, but with weariness. "Do you know what it's like," she said softly, "to be awake and asleep at the same time, to breathe like it's yours but move like it is, to hear your own voice and not know if it's choice or command?" Mercer's throat tightened. He had no answer. She picked the coin back up, rolling it once more. "They think silence is weakness, but silence is the only thing that's mine. When I close my eyes, when I breathe, that's me. That's the only part they can't take." Mercer wrote nothing in his notebook that night. He couldn't. Some truths were too heavy for paper. The following days, training carried on. Recruits cycled in and out. They arrived cocky, left quieter, more deliberate, shaped them with her silence. And each time Mercer watched, he felt the same gnawing question: was she saving them or hollowing them? One recruit, a young woman named Daniels, stayed after class one evening. She stood stiffly, nervous. "Ma'am," she said, "can I ask something?" Turned, braid falling over one shoulder. "Ask." "Do you ever regret it? Whatever made you this way?" The air hung still. For a moment Mercer thought wouldn't answer, but then her eyes softened just slightly. "Regret keeps you looking backward. Survival only lets you look forward, so no, not regret." Daniels nodded, though the answer seemed to trouble her more than reassure. When she left, Mercer stepped closer. "You could lied," he said quietly. Glanced at him. "Lies don't keep anyone alive." That night Mercer sat in his quarters, staring at the line he'd written weeks ago. "Sleepwalkers exist." He crossed it out, wrote instead, "Sleepwalkers carry weight we'll never understand." Word of her past began to leak in fragments, though no one knew the truth. Rumors spread through the ranks like wildfire. Some swore she had been part of a ghost unit that erased targets without ever being seen. Others claimed she had been broken, rebuilt, and used like a weapon. Some whispered she wasn't entirely human at all. None of it was accurate. All of it carried a piece of her silence. And Mercer realized something chilling. Truth didn't matter anymore. Legend had taken over. One evening, as the sun bled red across the desert horizon, stood at the edge of the yard, her duffel packed. Cross approached, boots crunching in the gravel. "You're transferring again," he said simply. "New site, higher clearance, the work continues." She adjusted the strap on her shoulder, and when it stops. Cross's face didn't change. "For people like you, it never really stops." She didn't argue. She just nodded once, eyes drifting toward the horizon. Mercer stepped forward, frustration in his voice. "She's not a tool you can keep moving around, sir. She's a person." Cross's gaze landed on him steady. "Then treat her like one. But don't forget, without people like her, you wouldn't be standing here." And with that, the SUV arrived again, headlights cutting across the compound. Climbed in without hesitation, duffel at her feet, coin in her hand, silence in her eyes. The door closed with a thud. As the vehicle rolled into the dark, Mercer stood rooted, heart heavy. He knew he'd see her again, but he also knew something had shifted beyond repair. For weeks he had tried to understand her. For weeks he had scribbled lines in a notebook, searching for answers. But the truth wasn't something to be written. It was something to be carried. And the silence she carried was heavier than any words he could put on paper. That night under the wide desert sky, Mercer whispered to himself, as though saying it aloud would keep it real. She was never sleeping, she was surviving. Why do some stories end without applause, yet echo louder than any celebration? The SUV carried away from the compound, headlights cutting through the desert night. She sat in the back, duffel at her feet, the brass coin rolling across her knuckles in steady rhythm. No music played. No one spoke. The hum of the engine filled the silence. For her, this was nothing new. Departures had always been her way of living. No goodbyes, no fanfare, just the next horizon. Training continued as if nothing had shifted. Boots hit the dirt at dawn, rifles cracked on the range, instructors barked across the yard. But underneath the noise, a quiet current remained. Soldiers who had seen her move carried the memory like a scar. They spoke less, laughed softer. Some avoided the corner of the yard where she had once sat cross-legged with her eyes closed. The legend didn't fade, it grew. They told the new recruits about her. Some said she could clear a building blindfolded. Others whispered she had been asleep for weeks until a commander spoke the secret word. The details changed with every retelling, but the heart of the story stayed. The woman they mocked as Sleepwalker had woken into something no one could explain. In the chow hall, Holt chewed in silence, hearing the old jokes replay in his mind until they tasted like ash. Scrubbed his boots until the leather cracked as if he could polish away his shame. Briggs muttered to himself in quiet corners, still haunted by her precision. And Vance filled page after page of his notebook, each line an unspoken apology written in the shape of procedures. His arrogance was gone. In its place, duty stripped bare. But none of them ever said her name aloud again. Not to each other, not to themselves. Some things were too heavy to carry in words. Mercer stayed late most nights, walking the perimeter of the yard where she had once sat. His notebook was full now, its pages worn thin, but the last entry remained blank. He couldn't finish it. Not yet. He thought of her coin, her rubber band, the way she breathed through mockery. He thought of the moment her eyes had opened at the code and the silence that followed every shot she fired. And he thought about what she told him. Silence was the only thing that was hers. Weeks passed, months. Her presence became absence. Her absence became rumor. And rumor became something larger, a lesson none of them could shake. One recruit, weeks into training, asked Mercer quietly during a night shift, "Sir, was she real?" Mercer didn't answer right away. He looked out across the desert, where the horizon seemed endless and the stars felt cold. Finally, he said, "She was real, but that's not the question you should ask. The question is how many more are out there, walking among us, ordinary until they are." The recruit stared at him, unsettled, then walked away. Mercer remained by the fence, the night air biting against his skin. He pulled out his notebook and finally wrote his last line. Sometimes silence isn't emptiness. Sometimes it's everything left unsaid. Somewhere beyond, in another compound with another set of recruits carried on. She trained. She instructed. She taught them how to breathe through fear, how to see shadows before they formed, how to move without wasting motion. She never raised her voice. She never boasted. She never explained who she was. Her students didn't need to know. They learned enough from the way she stood, the way she waited, the way she survived. And when they left her classes, they carried something more than tactics. They carried her silence. Years later, soldiers who had once been her students would move through battlefields unknown, their breath steady, their steps deliberate, their decisions quiet but precise. Some would survive where others would fall. Some would carry civilians out under fire, and none of them would understand fully why. Only that once they had been taught by someone who lived in silence and moved like a shadow. Never told her story. She never asked for recognition. She never sought redemption. She just passed it on, piece by piece, in the small, steady ways that left no trace but changed everything. For those who had seen her the memory never left. They remembered the laughter, the mockery, the scorn. They remembered how quickly contempt had turned into awe, and they remembered the moment the commander's voice had cut the air and turned silence into fire. None of them forgot, none of them could. Because once you see someone wake like that, you never look at silence the same way again. And so her story didn't end with applause or banners. It ended the way it began, in quiet. No speeches, no medals, just one soldier walking away into the desert night, carrying her silence like a shield. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.